Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Bob Hill. I'm the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Sciences here at the University of Adelaide, and I'm here to welcome you to tonight's Research Tuesday, which is titled, as you can see behind me, Unreconciled: Museums, Galleries and Aboriginal Art History. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Roseworthy, Waite and Theberton are built. Our June Research Tuesday event always falls just after National Reconciliation Week, and traditionally we aim to cover a theme that relates to issues of Aboriginal culture. Tonight is obviously a good example of that as we turn our attention to Aboriginal art history and the competing roles that our cultural institutions play in honouring it. Our speaker, Professor John Carty, is Professor of Anthropology in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Adelaide and Head of Anthropology at the South Australian Museum. And I'd just like to digress for a moment to say what a great example John is of the fantastic partnership that the University of Adelaide has with the South Australian Museum. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge Brian Oldman, the Director of the Museum, who's here tonight, and Jane Lomax-Smith, the Chair of the Board, who's also here for the really positive role they've played in developing that partnership. Now, John has worked through regional Australia on Aboriginal health, science and cultural projects, and he actively researches the role of museums in collaboration with the British Museum and the National Museum of Australia. Following John's presentation tonight, we'll invite questions from the audience, so please feel free to get involved. But first of all, please join me in welcoming Professor John Carty. Thanks, John.
Is that on? Can you hear me? Yes. Yes. Okay. Nyankirna, Mirna, Namarni. Nadlu, Tampinti Nadlu, Karna, Yatarka, Tikanti. Ladies and gentlemen, we acknowledge that we are here on the land of the Kaurna people. In the Kaurna tongue, I acknowledge that the museum that I work in, the university in which I'm employed, and the cultural sector that I want to talk about tonight are on and a part of Kaurna country. And that acknowledgement matters particularly to me in terms of my role at the museum, my role as a scholar, and our purpose in being here to listen to me speak at all tonight. So, yeah, I think it matters that you understand what you're acknowledging. And this is my home now. This is where my kids are going to grow up. And I think you can't belong in Australia without acknowledging the belonging of others. And again, this feeds into what I want to talk about tonight. I gave a lecture. Is it too loud? No, it's good. I'm just reverbing on myself here, so, you know. I gave a lecture 2 weeks ago which sought to pick apart the idea of a museum, and in particular, the South Australian Museum. I was reframing the museum as a site of reconciliation. I won't go back into the detail of that lecture tonight because some of you were there and I don't want to bore you. It's a terrible crime. But I want to explain how this lecture sits as a companion to that one. We have at the South Australian Museum arguably the most comprehensive collection of Aboriginal material culture in the world. Our galleries reveal but a minuscule fraction of that. In our off-site and clearly out of mind storage facility near the airport, we hold the keys to our continent. We have some 28,000 objects, 28,000 expressions of the creative ingenuity of Australia's first people. It's not the national collection. It's better than that. It is, as a colleague from the British Museum recently said, the collection. And with this extraordinary collection comes extraordinary responsibility. Our collections confer upon us both the burdens and the possibilities of our history. They demand of us an ongoing attention to the silences in our shared story. And as custodians of such silences, of such gaps in our vision, Australian museums have a greater burden than other institutions to tell Australian stories. Sometimes this will involve telling precisely those stories that it has been most difficult for us to hear. But overall, I flagged in that lecture the necessity to understand museums as cultural phenomena in and of themselves. We are not the static or objective archive of cultures and categories that museums were once imagined to be. Museums have grown or are growing out of that colonial cocoon. Museums are works in progress, charged with maturing on behalf of us all, in dialogue with the collections and with our custodianship. The natural evolution of the South Australian Museum will see us transform from a repository of colonial processes to a site of reconciliation. In the stories we tell and the people we tell them with, the museum is rethinking its role in Australian and in South Australian society. And it's not about reinventing the museum, it's just about realising it. The museum that amassed these collections was one kind of thing. The museum that will turn these collections out into the world, working with the ancestors of its authors, is another thing altogether. And given the importance of our collections, it's important that they are used in the service of contemporary Aboriginal people, not as sepia-toned newsreel of who Aboriginal people used to be, what they used to do, but as the building blocks through which Aboriginal people explore and express for themselves who they are today. There is an urgent need for the museum to tell stories about Australia today. And there is an equal need for the museum to start collecting Aboriginal art and material culture again, to start connecting our historical collections to the history that is being made every day. We used to do this. In fact, we did it better than anybody. It was the South Australian Museum who, in the 1980s, sent the first major exhibition of Aboriginal art to New York. This at a time when half the galleries in Australia were still debating whether these paintings were fine art or not. But somewhere along the way, we lost our nerve. When art galleries started to acknowledge the transformations of Aboriginal material culture as art, we seemed to stop collecting it. I don't know what happened there, whether it was just mutual pettiness or categorical confusion or what. We have the Yuendamu doors, for example, which are amongst the most important hinges in the transformations of Aboriginal art history. And yet we say almost nothing of the world onto which those doors open. The museum succumbed to a dubious orthodoxy in which galleries now collected the art and we collected the rest. The evolution of Aboriginal art and the transformations of forms of material culture and aesthetics into new mediums is amongst the most important and defining cultural narratives of the 20th and now the 21st century. It is the great artistic narrative that Australia has to share with the world. And it is not a story that can be left to the art historians or art galleries alone, because they simply don't have the collections to tell us the full story. Now, my friends at the art gallery, some of whom are here tonight, are going to tire of me using this image very quickly. But you're going to have to forgive me. This is the shtick that I'm going to use until we get our act together. This is an iceberg, obviously. The South Australian Museum has the bottom part of the iceberg. The Art Gallery of South Australia has the top bit. It's a very beautiful bit. It's a crisp, white, glorious bit. But there's a weight of Australian art history that needs to be connected. And what I'm talking about tonight is pursuing that image. And I'm pursuing it down the laneway. That was a nice transition. I was pleased with that. I walk down this laneway almost every day. And every time I walk down it, I think about the difference between the art gallery and the museum. Every day, because I'm someone who works conceptually and practically and historically between these institutions, I question what the difference is sometimes, and the historical constitution of these very different institutions, and the tiny little gap between them into which such an important story seems to slip. So it's a metaphor, but it's kind of not. It's actually a physical problem. It's a conceptual problem. It's a historical problem. This laneway between our buildings becomes a barrier between our collections. A fracture into which the most important story that we can tell has fallen. So who then has the responsibility for our art history? I think Aboriginal art demands too much of either museums or galleries, and that indeed the only way to do justice to art and the stories for which such institutions are custodians is to explore more collaborative, intellectual and practical collaborations. And we are in Adelaide right now better positioned than anyone else in the country, and better positioned than any other moment in time to define and to claim this ground in Australia. But I'll come back to this in conclusion, because I know this is actually called Research Tuesdays, not Grand Vision Tuesdays. So I need to probably talk about some research. And so to open up this question of the tension between these institutions, I want to look at art history. And I want to drill down into one particular expression of Aboriginal art that highlights both the trajectories of my own research and the incredible strengths of the South Australian Museum and the incredible opportunities that exist between the cultural institutions on North Terrace. So I've spent the last 15 years or so working with artists in the Western Desert primarily. I've done other things, but the majority of my research has been with artists in the Western Desert. This is sort of the Western Desert. You know, it's bigger than this actually. It comes all the way through here. But it's an extraordinary area of Australia, and it's a heartland for the creative renaissance of Aboriginal people across the continent. And this is Western Desert painting, which will be familiar to anyone who's been called into the director of the South Australian Museum's office to be scolded recently, or just to be congratulated for being a great staff member. Ura Ura Jangala. It's extraordinary and beautiful artwork. The translation and transformation of traditional Western desert iconography, narrative conventions and aesthetics onto canvas and into contemporary art is among the most important artistic achievements in Australia's art history. In Australia's history, probably. Yet if you read art criticism, art history, or attend exhibitions, it seems we've run out of things to say about it. It's not that there isn't any writing about desert art, there's more writing today than ever before. It's just that most of it won't tell you anything we didn't know when Dreamings came out in the 1980s. Stale and tentative words sprout around the corners of canvases in a wonder-numbing repetition of unexamined tropes and themes. The power of the dreaming, Aboriginal spirituality, shimmering ancestral presences, the genius of an elder, or the importance of country to an artist. All of these things are important, don't get me wrong, but they are meaningless if the person writing them down hasn't thought about and researched what they mean. Art historians regularly employ Western desert painting as a case study for examining categorical transitions from ethnographic to fine art, or from world art to contemporary art, or whatever is the currency of the day. Yet somewhat remarkably, art historians in Australia rarely actually do any research with the art or the artists in question. How can this be, I hear you ask? And this is not just me saying this, I'll qualify all of this, but Ian McLean, who's one of the most esteemed thinkers in the terrain of contemporary art and Aboriginal art in Australia, in this book, which is about how Aborigines invented the idea of contemporary art, basically says, oh, it's great what we're doing, except that no art historians have actually done any research with Western Desert artists when you talk about this. There is a fundamental and breathtaking kind of gap in the scholarship around this. Now, undoubtedly, the cross-cultural differences between most art historians and Western Desert painters do make it difficult. But surely that is part of the job. Art historians learn French and Italian in order to work within those traditions. Why should we expect less in Australia? To be qualified to speak on the Renaissance, on the Flemish masters, or on the waves of modernism, we assume an art historian has done some original research. They will at the very least have studied the paintings of the artist about whom they speak. They'll be able to compare them to other works in the artist's oeuvre and to the works of other artists in general. They'll be able to discuss technique along with the influences of peers and past masters on the development of an individual's style. They will know something of the artist's life, of their historical and social contexts, political convictions, and their spiritual traditions. And they'll be able to interpret artistic nuance and transformations on the canvas in the light of these richly wrought details. And so it is that anthropologists working in Australia today have tended to become the accidental art historians of these movements. This is not because we have any privileged insight. Usually we don't. But it's because our discipline encourages the kind of holistic attention required to do justice to the art. Formal analysis, historical and social context, biography and aesthetics. In other contexts, these would be the descriptors for a comprehensive art historical approach. And in Australian discourse, it often falls curiously under the pejorative of being ethnographic. Why is that? For the past decades, curators, anthropologists, art historians have fought hard to have Aboriginal painting recognised as fine art, as the equal of any great art produced anywhere at any time. An important and perhaps necessary stage in that process involved distinguishing desert art from the ethnographic that was familiar to people going into museums. But this temporary categorical two-step has been too successful, and it's calcified into ideological positions, into disciplines, and indeed into whole institutions. And here's my favourite example of what this means. In 2010, opening the most important display of Aboriginal art in Australia, the director of the National Gallery, Adelaide's own Ron Radford, stated that the galleries are rooms consciously and unapologetically designed for the permanent collection of Indigenous art, not anthropology. This sentence contains the remarkable achievement of misunderstanding both anthropology and art in the same breath. It is neither accurate nor helpful to conflate the content or cultural context of a painting with anthropology or some ethnographic framework, as if these modes of understanding were somehow inherently opposed to the intent of the artist, or indeed the art historian. Radford posits a divide between art historical and anthropological research that is not sustainable in Australia, or anywhere in an increasingly globalised world in which Indigenous artists are contributing to and reshaping the very idea of art. Worse than this, lazy rhetoric inhibits art historians from conducting the kind of fine-grained research or fieldwork that would help to bridge the divide. Art historians, critics and curators are constantly arguing for the need to move beyond some scarecrow in a pith helmet called the ethnographic and to treat Aboriginal works of art on their own terms. But no one has ever attempted to establish those terms. And I suspect that is because they are not possible to establish without the cultural information summarily dismissed under the umbrella of the ethnographic. I live in a state of almost permanent agitation about this. This is my calming blue painting. Just stops me getting too far gone, halfway through. I know it's not enough to be indignant or dismissive. This is very difficult terrain. If we want better scholarship, better understanding of art and of the artists who are increasingly claiming their place in a globalised world, then anthropology has to claim its place in those debates too, as do museums. That means claiming some of the public real estate around these issues and taking art historians, critics and curators with us. It may also involve anthropologists engaging in some subterfuge and possibly wearing black skivvies and berets to exhibition openings instead of bare feet and billums. Note the blue velvet jacket. This is my attempt to seem palatable. Anthropology and art history overlap in really important areas, but in Australia this overlap masks a gap between the disciplines. And it's a gap that's partly methodological and partly conceptual, in which the formal analysis of artworks is disconnected from the biographical, cultural, and ultimately historical processes that shape those forms. So what I've been trying to do in my own research in the Western Desert over the past 10 to 15 years is to create a bridging body of work, to establish the terms, so to speak, and to create something like an anthropologically informed art history, or what may also just be considered the first steps in simply an Aboriginal art history. And before coming back to the pressing questions of North Terrace, then I'm going to quickly explain this work. The research project I'm undertaking over the next 5 years, funded by the Australian Research Council, is in many ways the resolution of the previous decade. It's a phase in which I'm consciously engaged in the challenge of producing art historical outcomes from anthropological scholarship. Now, I won't go into this in depth, but this is just a visual representation of what I'm talking about. It's a project in which I'm seeking to look at the geographical range of artistic practice in the Western Desert, exploring the human connectivity across that region through the genealogies and kinship diagram you see underneath, and a formal analysis of individual artists' oeuvre throughout the region, looking at the transformations in style within individual artists' careers and across the region. If I had the mad PowerPoint skills of the younger generation, I would have done some kind of vortex that showed you how those things connect together. But it doesn't look like most of you have those skills either, so we're all in the same boat. Forgive me. So the model for my fieldwork comes from a place called Balgo, where I lived for 3 years and where I continue to work, which is where I did my PhD work. And I've tried through formal analysis to develop a richer language that would allow us to speak about Aboriginal art with the same depth and quality and integrity and curiosity as we do about other kinds of art. The limitations of our discussions about Aboriginal art often stem from failing to recognise in the Western Desert, say, that the processes of abstraction did not merely resonate with the Western aesthetic, but it involved a process of artistic and cultural abstraction in and of itself. You can't know this by reading Clement Greenberg in Australia, you can only know it by reading Nancy Munn. You have to understand how an Aboriginal visual system works before you can understand how it has changed. We don't try and describe Picasso before understanding what representation is. You have to walk before you can run. And I'll show you briefly what I mean. So in Balgo, this is the work of Nancy Nunanara, one artist. In Balgo, over the period of the 1980s when the art movement began and the early 2000s when I was working there, there'd been this extraordinary process of transformation, of abstraction, or what I call abstraction. This is the work by Nancy Nananara. In the first exhibition of Balgo art in 1986, 75 to 80% of the paintings that were in that exhibition at the Art Gallery of Western Australia were strongly iconographic. They were full of iconography. In 20 years later, during the period of my research, this same artist was producing paintings like this. And it wasn't just Nancy Nananara, it was almost all of the artists had gone through a process of moving from deeply iconographic work to seemingly really abstract works. And we needed a language to describe what was going on there. It's not simply a case of saying it's the same as Western abstraction. What happened in Balgo art? You can understand through the prism of 2 or 3 main parts of the visual system, dotting and outlining in particular. So dots are, the quintessential iconic form of Western desert sort of aesthetics. Originally, dots were not particularly prominent in desert art, as many of you will know. These paintings by Jimmy Nyami, Mick Gill and Larry Doherty from the early 1980s, the first paintings really that men in Balgo did on board. And you can see from them that the dots are used to outline the icons. Over here, they're used to kind of embed the icons in an animated frame, but they're used to make the icons visible in ceremony. The dots of vegetable fluff that are used around the iconographic forms on a dark-skinned body at night. It's the white dots that you actually see, not the forms itself. So the dottings are what animate the forms. But over a period of time, as people started painting, and some of the missionaries at the time sort of encouraged people to fill the canvas, people spread the dots out and explored what they could do. They experimented with dots and with outlining. And in this painting you can see, this is only a couple of years later by Minnie Napanunka, that whilst the iconography is now still surrounded by dots, you can still see them highlighted, the bands of dotting that we saw earlier have actually become the background. So where there was no background, suddenly the dotting itself has become the animating field that holds the iconography. It's not just something that highlights it, it's increasingly becoming the field of the picture plane. And these experiments continued and continued and continued at Belgrade over many years until it was almost that the lines themselves became the art, that the there are still a few iconographic forms in this painting, but ultimately it's the act of painting that is becoming the animating force of Western desert art. This is Elizabeth, no it's not, it's Ningi Nanala. And what's really interesting in Balgo in that style is the act of, the dot is like a protein. It's like the building block of art. So as people abstracted and pulled the dot off in all these different directions, it wasn't just a free-for-all. It was a deeply constrained cultural process, as well as being a really remarkable creative one. Each of these styles that were generated in Balgo around this time were predicated upon this building block of the dot. If you look really closely at Ningi's work, it looks really linear. But actually what she's done is she's created a technique of a really viscous way of applying the paint, where she mixes the paint with water, drops it down, and then gets another dot and drops it next to it so it kind of runs together like acrylic mercury. And it creates, out of dotting, this really linear, mesmerising kind of field. Euban and Nampijan, who was another pioneer of different styles in Balgo, used to put the paintbrush in different colours and then make these sculptural florets of dots, still dotting, but running them together with her hand. Boxer Milner was a really, and these are all really close-up details of these artists' work so you can understand what I'm talking about in terms of technique. Used to place a dot down and then place another dot on top and pick it up to create these sort of peaks that captured the light and created incredible depth in his paintings, like a kind of braille. You can read his paintings with your eyes closed, just running your fingers. Art curators would hate this, but you can. I used to have to clean all the muck off these paintings and the tea and stuff, and they're really beautiful to touch. Elizabeth, this is a terrible picture, sorry, but Elizabeth Newmy is another artist who created a technique with dotting of using fine sticks and a really fine overlocker kind of technique, pulling the stick in and out of the paint pot and creating this really loose, really wonderful rhythm, which that's a really close-up shot of her work, but that's what that creates, is this incredible energy in the artworks. It's this energy, these energetic compositions that people in Balgo found themselves making instead of using iconography with dots around it to reveal the power and the animism or the animation of the dreaming and the importance of the dreaming in their works. People realised that the power of the composition was what captured the audience. It's what captured our eyes and arrested our attention and focused our attention on the power of Aboriginal knowledge and law and authority. This is what these artists were doing in their processes of abstraction. And so you get, I'm talking about the dissolution of iconography. So in the first Balgo painting exhibition in 1986, there was about 80% of the paintings were iconographic. In 2004, about 15% were. It's a major transformation of the visual system. There's still lots of iconography in this picture. You can see images of women and coolamons and bush fruits in there. But if you watch Newmy paint, there's not a narrative here that these iconography follow. The iconography is the structuring template for the act of dotting, where dotting once animated the forms. Now the forms structure the act of painting. Not all groups in the desert have abstracted in this way. If you look at the Spinifex artists who were on display at Tainandi Festival here at the Art Gallery of South Australia, their particular and localised art history is tied to native title and tied to these paintings defining your birthplace and your capacity to show in the whitefella system evidence of your belonging. And so Spinifex art is still deeply tied to the reproduction of iconography because it's deeply tied conceptually to the idea of evidence. So there are different art histories playing out around the desert. If you look at Nganadara art, you'll see there's this sculptural quality to the way that colours are layered to create depth in the way that relates to carving traditions. And there's a focus on figuration which relates to weaving traditions. There are these different art histories playing out across this region that we think of as the Western Desert. And they're absolutely spectacularly interesting, and we don't have a language for it. But I think most art historians are happy to follow me this far. There's abstraction, there's style, there's localised art histories. Here's where it gets a little bit uncomfortable. They can't talk about the changes occurring in these localised artistic traditions because the only way to understand how this artistic system is reproduced through time, instead of just being the paintings that you see at a moment in time in the gallery, how processes of apprenticeship and stylistic transmission congeal into cultural practice is to understand the role of kinship in Western desert life. And let's face it, talking about kinship systems has not been a big feature of art world discourse to date. It's not particularly sexy, but it's going to be, because I've got the diagrams to prove it. Now, what I've found in my research in Balgo, but also around the desert, is that the innovations and abstractions pioneered by individual artists are passed on as a form of cultural property. These dotting styles and dotting techniques that have been pulled out of the visual tradition of ground sculptures and body paint and rock art they've been turned into culture They're not something separate from cultural processes. And they can only therefore be shared or passed on between the right people. If you look at Elizabeth Newmy, who I spoke about before, she created this frenetic kind of technique. But she's an older lady with one eye who's completely got her own technique going. Each of her daughters, so this is a kinship diagram. This is what anthropologists love. We love it. You'll love it too. Just give it a try. Diagrams. This is a kinship diagram where anthropologists often show, how families are connected. There's a mother and 3 daughters. You can see in each of those paintings from each of Newmy's daughters an appropriation or a pulling through of her style, but each of them doing it a slightly different way because each of them has to find their own style within that style. I love this image because I think if you pressed the 3 daughters together, you'd almost get a Newmy. Not quite. It goes down to the level of technique. Those daughters are too neat to produce their mother's technique in the same way that she does. But you look at Ubin and Nampijin here on the left, who's one of the great Belgo painters who created those sculptural kind of florets, the way that she dotted. This is her granddaughter. And these are details again, but you can see that she's not simply representing the palette or the structure or composition of Ubina's work. She's reproducing the technique. The technique is almost copyrighted. I was once in the art centre when somebody brought in a painting that had dots connected in a certain kind of way that looked nothing like someone else's painting. But the family got very upset because they said that person's stealing our country. Not they're stealing our style, not they're connecting the dots in a certain kind of way, but that they're stealing our country. That such is the importance in the cultural process of translating visual forms, that to copy someone's technique was tantamount to the worst cultural crime you could imagine. Which is just to reinforce how important it is to do the formal analysis in order to understand the cultural connotations of what we're looking at. And you also get transformations. I won't go into this too long because I'll probably labour it, but say between, this is the father, Jumpa, a really wonderful old painter who was married to Ningi, who you've seen earlier. Winifred produced this sort of style that was halfway between the structure of the old man, but the palette of her mother, and somewhere between the looseness and the tightness of a new generation. The impact of kinship in influencing the nature and timing of apprenticeship and stylistic transmission in Aboriginal art is crucial to understanding the intimacies of artistic development in the desert. It's also critical to understanding the more expansive Aboriginal processes that inflect and influence the development of painting practices at different times and places across the past 40 years. Glimpses of this regional connectivity emerged in the research I conducted around the Canning Stock Route in 2007 to 2010, where kinship, social and ceremonial relations between people living at different ends of the Western Desert were identified as catalytic factors in the development of schools and styles of painting at different moments in time. I won't go into this in great detail tonight, but this is the style tree that came out of that project, which shows basically 7 or 8 different geographically located different art centres, all connected actually as a family group spread out by the processes of history and the Canning Stock Route to different ends of the Western Desert, painting in different styles, sometimes painting in similar styles, but you can pull across the whole art history of the Western Desert through this prism of family and of the interaction between artists at different moments in time. So this project that I'm talking about, the research that I'm doing and the research that I've done, combines this genealogical research with formal analysis to compare the work of artists through space and time. But genealogy, for all its usefulness, doesn't guarantee a thorough Aboriginal perspective on style and how it passes between people. It tells you how it should pass down the generations, but not necessarily how it does in practice. And that's why you need to work directly with artists. And a lot of what I'll be doing over the next few years is recording extensive oral histories and extensive art histories with key artists across the desert. This was part of the Canningstock group. Note, no velvet jacket there. Oral histories tend to include the kinds of people, relationships and events in an artist's life that formal genealogies or formal analysis leave out. Recorded in Aboriginal languages, these narratives also bring Indigenous categories and conceptual frames to bear on the questions of art in which we so regularly find debates ensnared at the limits of our language. Euro-American art history tends to deal with dead artists, and it can afford to because there's usually an archive of potentially inexhaustible or at least discoverable information about their lives. We can't afford that luxury in Australia, where the lives of many Aboriginal artists become opaque, if not completely unknowable, for cultural reasons as well, after their death. So I find myself talking about the slightly contradictory notion of real-time art history. Because if we wait for art historical time, analysing these movements only in retrospect, there will be no meaningful art historical scholarship of Australia's most important art movement. Are we going to sleepwalk through our art history in the same way that we sleepwalked through our history? Language, kinship, country, the dreaming, diagrams. Of course art historians aren't obliged to be interested in all these things and to be trained in them. But we need to accept that without them you cease to have access to almost everything important about that art. And we need to stop pretending an adequate Australian art history is possible without them. We've reached the limits of what it is possible to say about desert art, or at least of what it is worth saying, but not in the way most commentators would have us believe. There is nothing intrinsic to the art or to the cross-cultural ambiguity or complexity of it that prescribes such limits. Rather, these are the challenges around which a richer Australian language must evolve. These are the conceptual, political and historical challenges around which our cultural institutions must evolve. Reconciling art history and anthropology is not, for me, an intellectual endeavour. It's more than that. It is about ensuring that the arbitrary divides in scholarly disciplines don't inhibit the interpretation, understanding and appreciation for what is the most important and interesting art tradition this country has ever known. It doesn't matter where these stories get told, it only matters that they get told. And in that I'm addressing a higher stakes process of reconciliation between the institutions charged with collecting and sharing this story. Well, there you go. Art gallery friends. I wasn't intending that one, but that will help. At the South Australian Museum, we have a responsibility to tell the story of the cultures and the material cultures of Australia's first people. That means we have a mandated responsibility, an ethical and an intellectual one, to continue to connect our collections to the dynamics of that culture as it manifests, not only as history, but also through a more richly wrought art history as contemporary culture and contemporary art. This doesn't put us in conflict with the Art Gallery of South Australia. Indeed, it brings us closer together than ever before. That laneway has, for some time now, been a gulf in the story, but now it can become a bridge. We have a common purpose, perhaps for the first time. I really wanted there to be a laneway picture there. Pull it up. Laneway's bridge. The art gallery has an important role to play in provoking an ongoing engagement with the questions of art and the ways in which Aboriginal artists intersect with and challenge our preconceptions and our categories. And that's what these slides were showing you from the Elder Wing at the moment. These juxtapositions between what is an art historical collection, what is an ethnographic collection. The collections of the South Australian Museum are an important resource for the gallery in this endeavour. These kinds of juxtapositions and those proposed in the Gallery of Time that's been discussed recently in the papers, wherein European, Asian and Aboriginal traditions would be displayed together, provide an ongoing and important impetus to the debate. to the visibility of Aboriginal artists and to their integral and ongoing role in unhinging the master narratives of the West. The role of the museum here is essential, and you cannot tell that story without our collections. Oh, I didn't mean to be on the iceberg. Sorry, art gallery friends. But it's the 28,000 elephants in the room, really, isn't it? There's nothing oppositional in the metaphor when I talk about the iceberg, when I talk about the wealth of the story that the South Australian Museum has to contribute to Australian art history. Because you look at the iceberg, it's one thing. It's one thing. The question is how we talk about that one thing. So our role at the museum I see as being complementary. Rather than reaching out into global art history, as the art gallery must do, our role is probably to dig deeper into the local. Our mandate is not to tell stories about art as such, but to tell stories with it. To connect the contemporary voices, knowledge and practice of Aboriginal people to the historical, political, scientific and philosophical questions facing Australia. I argued in my introduction that the importance of the South Australian Museum's Aboriginal collections brings with it a singular level of responsibility. It also presents an unparalleled level of opportunity. We know that tourists come to Australia hoping to have a rich engagement with Aboriginal culture. The problem is most people don't know where to go to begin that experience. As Australia debates the need for a centralised Aboriginal art and cultural destination for tourists in Sydney, such as Barangaroo, or in Alice Springs, we should take pause. Those projects are overdue, and they will surely be of great value when they do materialise. But such projects are still years and many debates and many, many millions of dollars away. South Australia, sitting as we do at the hinge between the east and the centre, has an opportunity right now, and indeed an economic imperative in the state to seize that vacant ground. It wouldn't take much to turn Adelaide into the destination of choice for local and international tourism seeking a deep and dynamic experience of Australian and Aboriginal art and culture. The renewal of the Art Gallery of South Australia over recent times is a breathtaking achievement that shows what can be done with a creative vision and the leadership to make it happen. It has helped, along with Tanandi and many other developments in the festival and cultural sector, to define Adelaide as the most dynamic destination in Australian art. And the regeneration of the South Australian Museum, with arguably the best collection of Aboriginal material culture in the world, is the jewel in that crown. We have our own overdue work to do in polishing that particular jewel, in making it shine, in telling our story. But it is without doubt the axis upon which the invigoration of the state cultural sector must now turn. We look forward to reaching across the laneway to play our creative and collaborative role in the years ahead. We have a rare opportunity, given the geographical location, for an art gallery and a museum like that to cooperate, to collaborate, and to transform the kinds of stories that it is possible to tell in Australia. But I should say in conclusion that it's not just this laneway. There are other laneways. Not all of them are on North Terrace. I'm really looking forward to collaborating with Flinders. Can you talk about Flinders here? Flinders? Tandanya, Samstag, History SA? Yeah? Good. In fact, anyone who will have us, we're happy to collaborate with you. The South Australian Museum is open for business, and we're very, very excited about being part of rejuvenating the economy and the sector, and maybe I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We have a couple of microphones we can take around for people with questions. We've got one at the top here.
Oh, come on. I gave a lecture 2 weeks ago. It was completely different, and there were still no questions. Oh, there is one.
My name's Patrick Mangan, John. I should have known a gentleman with the initials JC would provide a fantastic lecture. I just have one quick comment, a couple of quick questions. The first comment is, about 20 years ago I started doing some consulting work at Mitsubishi, which is now metamorphosing into Tonsley Hub. And first week I worked in the admin centre, and I said, I need to go to production. How far away is it? I said, about 10 years. So your lane vision reminded me of that comment. Are you aware that fashion is going through a similar kind of dilemma where people are saying, is fashion art? And I guess places like Bendigo Art Gallery, who keep bringing exhibitions from V&A, are kind of exploring that concept. So that's a question for you, given that you're very stylishly dressed tonight. The second question is about, are you aware that in Paris there's recently an Islamic art museum opened, and one of their missions is to involve and engage Islamic youth with a point of using the art exhibitions to educate, get them to do research at that basic level, to educate them with regard to what really Islam is about. They were the two questions I had.
In relationship to fashion, yeah, I think some of the best art exhibitions in the last 5 years have been fashion shows. Which goes to the point, there was a period when that wouldn't have been possible in an art gallery. And that's when I say these institutions should not be defined by what they've been. Art galleries, museums should be places where the big questions remain on the table, where we don't square away what culture is, what creativity is, what art is. They're the arena in which we hash out who we are by whatever means necessary. And I think fashion is an extremely important part of how humans express ourselves. I thought a long time about this jacket. In terms of the second part of the question, I didn't know about the particular art gallery that you're talking about, a museum, but one of the things that we're really focused on at the South Australian Museum at the moment is thinking about who we are accountable to. Who is our constituency? Is it just the European tourists who come through the door who want to learn a little bit about Aboriginal culture? Or do we actually have an ethical and historical responsibility to our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, to our Aboriginal constituency, for whom we are the custodians of really important material? That maybe a lot of what we should be doing is turning ourselves towards them and opening our doors towards them, and of the museum being not an archive or a cataloguer of culture, but a participant as an agent of culture. And Aboriginal people may want to use the museum in different ways, and the museum has to be open and vulnerable and ready to become what it needs to be to service different parts of our community. So that's how I'd answer the question about the Islamic youth.
John, we've got one over here and then one on the other side at the front.
Thank you for that inspiring talk. Uncle Lewis O'Brien, who is a friend, explains Aboriginal art is that in the times when you could see the night sky, what happened in the night sky was mirrored on Earth in both its predictions and its behaviour, which gave you the capacity to see like an eagle. And so dot painting is seeing like an eagle, which is beyond wonderment, that's beyond miracles. And I've just done this dot painting course where there are figures that only males can and only males. And so what you're doing is part of the inspiring traditions of museums. Thank you.
Thank you.
The speed of evolution of Aboriginal art is astronomical, partly because our First Nations are young. Yet your iceberg is Snow White. Drop it. It's an insult to your topic. And I don't know of any Ghana or other First Nations people employed at the museum. Why? And do you have any Aboriginal students? And if not, why?
They are 3 excellent questions. So I'm going to need a different metaphor. I think everyone at the art gallery will be pleased about that. It's the last time you'll see my white iceberg. Thank you. It's a good idea. We have several Aboriginal staff at the museum, but we don't have enough. And a huge part of what we are doing right now is to rethink what our... I can talk about what a museum should do, but that's actually not good enough. There needs to be other voices in our museum determining what the museum does, and they need to be Aboriginal voices working in collaboration with settler Australians to tell stories for all of us. So what we've done in the last few months is put together a series of transformations. So we're going to have a new cadetship program where we're bringing in younger local Aboriginal people to work in the museum and to figure out if they want to keep working in the museum, to see it as a potential career. We've just got funding for early career placements for young Aboriginal scholars who may be working in finishing their PhD or who've already done a bit of work in museums but who want to come and work on a project with us to help tell stories. And even more importantly, due to a pretty visionary act of philanthropy that I'm still very overwhelmed by, we've just confirmed today that we will be able to employ an Aboriginal curator to stand side by side with me and do this work that I'm talking about ongoing now. So even in the last... Oh look, we should have done it years ago, you know. We should have done it a long time ago. But what I'm saying is that we're doing it. And I respect very much the question, because I think it's an important one to ask. And we have fallen behind in that area, and we're going to make up the ground very quickly.
Thank you. We all love your answer.
John, I'm really fascinated by your observation regarding a transformation from an iconographic form to a more abstract form in Aboriginal art. I've noticed a similar transformation with some artists and their communities on the APY lands, communities such as Iwancha. Given that kinship systems extend beyond supposedly distinct areas, such as from the APY lands to the limits of the Western Desert, is it possible, in your opinion, that the influence of kinship structures has given rise to this parallel in the transformation of Aboriginal art across Central Desert, Western Desert regions?
Wow, people in Adelaide ask really good questions. People in Canberra just sort of go, don't like it.
It depends.
It depends. It's a spectacular question. Look, things are changing. Kinship is changing. Kinship is an invisible layer that structures and guides the way that things happen. That if you don't address it, you basically don't have access to the processes of change. You can see things happening in the gallery. Oh, that person used to do that and now they do that. Oh, they're just abstracting. No, you know, you have to follow an Aboriginal logic. You have to submit your intelligence to Aboriginal concepts in order to understand what's going on. And I guess that's the main message for me in terms of looking at that rapprochement between anthropology and art history in Australia is to honour how fundamentally frickin' fascinating that art history is, which we have not done. We have not honoured what these artists have been doing because we haven't had the language. So kinship twists things, and you could also argue that painting and the economy and the scale of it also twists kinship, and that it spreads and it retracts not just around kinship but around geography and around other historically constituted sort of ways that people live and have been forced to live by the process of colonisation. So there's no simple answer to that wonderful question, but yes. Yeah. I'm still working it out. That's why there's this research project.
I think we've got time for just one more question in the middle there.
John, you showed a slide with a generational change in art styles. Some
Yep.
of the communities have art centres and art directors. When there's a change in art director, do you notice a difference in the style or the colours from a change of director in some of those art centres?
Yeah, look, like Kinship. I mean, everything impacts on what an artist does. Different art centres have different paints available, different colours available. What I find most interesting, the short answer to your question is yes. Because different arts advisors come into working communities, they have their own aesthetic. And they communicate that very subtly, sometimes not so subtly, either by giving people certain kinds of paint, certain palettes, certain scales of canvas, but also in the kind of feedback that they give about painting. And so people in the desert are very conscious of what they're, being told by arts coordinators. But what you find is that there are people like Patrick Jungarai who paint. He won the Telstra Art Award in 2001 with a black and white painting. Spectacular, cerebral composition, just black and white. And then the next year in Balgo, he was painting these psychedelic purple, pink, blue, green, yellow giant things. They're just because he liked playing with colour. He liked when he was living at Kiwikura and painting with the Papunya Tula palette. He liked that. When he went to Balgo, he liked playing with colour, and he eventually merged those two art schools together in what is a really fascinating art history to create a kind of style that merged the influences from different parts of the desert. And you can see this across the families when they paint in different communities. They'll often not just paint with the Balgo style, but they'll adopt the style of the country in which they're painting, which is to tell you that art is not one immutable thing that people carry around with them, but it has this permeability to the cultural and political and personal kind of fluctuations of people's lives, as with any artist, That's the end of what I was going to say there, Bob.
Okay. Look, can you please join me again in thanking John for his talk tonight? Thank you, John.